Imagine giving away so much money that you accidentally destroy the economies of 3 countries, not through war, not through sanctions, just by being too rich and too generous. In 1324, a man rode through the Sahara Desert with 60,000 soldiers, 12,000 enslaved servants, and 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of pure gold. He passed through cities and handed out treasure like it was nothing. He built mosques. He threw coins into crowds. He paid for everything in gold: food, lodging, gifts, with a generosity the world had never seen. And by the time he left, the economies of Egypt, Arabia, and parts of Europe were in ruins. It would take over a decade for gold prices to recover. His name was Mansa Musa, and he was, by any modern measure, the wealthiest human being who ever lived. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the empire that made him. The Mali Empire in the early 14th century was not a footnote in history. It was one of the largest, most powerful, and most sophisticated empires on Earth, stretching across nearly 2 million square kilometers of West Africa, from the Atlantic coast deep into the Saharan interior. At its peak, it controlled more than half of the world's supply of gold and salt, 2 commodities that, in the medieval world, were essentially money itself. Mansa Musa came to the throne around 1312. His rise wasn't uncomplicated. He became king after the previous ruler, Abu Bakr II, sailed into the Atlantic Ocean on an expedition to find the edge of the world and never returned. Musa, who had been serving as deputy, inherited an empire already overflowing with wealth. But what he did with that wealth, and how he chose to display it, would rewrite the map of the known world. He was a devout Muslim, deeply committed to his faith. And in Islam, every able-bodied Muslim who can afford the journey is expected to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. For most rulers, this would be a private, spiritual journey. For Mansa Musa, it was something else entirely. He spent years preparing. His entourage would become the most extravagant procession in recorded history. 60,000 soldiers and attendants, wives, courtiers, scholars, and heralds. 500 of his personal servants walking ahead of him, each carrying a golden staff weighing nearly 3 kilograms, and then the camels, 80 of them, each loaded with 300 pounds of gold dust. Historians estimate he brought somewhere between 9 and 13 tons of gold on this journey. In today's terms, that's anywhere from $5 to $15 billion walking through the desert. And he intended to spend it. As the procession moved northeast through Mali, then into the Sahara, then into Egypt, it became something that looked less like a pilgrimage and more like a traveling civilization. Entire local markets were transformed wherever they stopped. Musa paid full price for everything and then tipped. He gave gold to the poor who lined the roads. He commissioned mosques and schools. He handed gifts to foreign rulers and dignitaries. Cairo, one of the greatest cities on earth, had never seen anything like it. And that's exactly where things began to go wrong, not for Musa, but for everyone else. When you flood a market with gold, the value of gold falls. That's simple economics. Supply goes up, prices go up, value goes down. But in the 14th century, there were no economists, no central banks, no circuit breakers. There was just gold, suddenly everywhere, handed out by a king who didn't stop to think about what happens when a commodity loses its scarcity. In Egypt, prices for basic goods began to rise sharply. The gold that Cairo's merchants had earned and saved, stored and traded for generations, it was suddenly worth less. Not because the gold had changed, but because there was so much more of it. Musa had, almost accidentally, triggered one of the earliest recorded cases of hyperinflation in history. The Egyptian economy took more than 12 years to stabilize. And it wasn't just Egypt. The gold moved west into the Mediterranean trade networks. It reached Arabia. It leaked into European markets through the complex webs of medieval commerce. Wherever it traveled, it disrupted, prices shifted, trade balances bent, the value of precious metal, the backbone of medieval finance, wobbled across an entire hemisphere. Here is the extraordinary, almost absurd irony of what happened next. Mansa Musa, the man who had just caused an inflation crisis across 3 continents, ran low on cash on the way home. Not because he was poor, because he had given so much away. So he borrowed gold from Egyptian lenders at interest. The richest man in the history of the world took out a loan, and he repaid it, of course, in gold. But the image of it is almost poetic. A king so generous, he temporarily outgave himself. Back in Mali, his journey had a second consequence, one far more lasting than inflation. He brought scholars, architects, and poets home with him. He commissioned the construction of magnificent mosques and libraries. He brought the great architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili from Granada to design new buildings that blended North African and West African styles. The city of Timbuktu, already significant, became one of the world's great centers of Islamic learning. At its height, it housed over 200 schools and a university that attracted scholars from across the Muslim world. Musa had not just moved gold, he had moved knowledge, art, architecture, and culture. He put Mali on the map, literally. After his pilgrimage, European cartographers began drawing the Mali Empire on world maps, sometimes depicting Musa himself seated on a throne, holding a golden scepter surrounded by his wealth. The 1375 Catalan Atlas, one of the most important maps of the medieval world, shows him at the center of Africa, larger than any other figure. He had become the world's symbol of impossible wealth. Mansa Musa died around 1337, though the exact date remains uncertain. The empire he left behind didn't last within a century. Internal conflict and external pressure from the Songhai Empire would fracture and ultimately dissolve Mali's power. The gold fields were eventually depleted. The libraries of Timbuktu were later ransacked. The civilization he built was, in many ways, erased from the Western historical record, hidden behind centuries of colonial scholarship that struggled to accept that such wealth and sophistication had existed in sub-Saharan Africa. But the story of Mansa Musa survived. It survived in trade records and tax documents, in traveler accounts and Arabic manuscripts, in that Catalan map. And it survives today as a reminder of something we still don't fully understand about wealth, that its effects radiate far beyond the person who holds it. Here is what Mansa Musa's story actually teaches us. Wealth at an extraordinary scale doesn't just belong to the person who possesses it. It reshapes everything it touches: markets, cultures, cities, and histories. Musa didn't try to crash 3 economies. He wasn't calculating or malicious. He was generous, faithful, and proud. But the scale of his resources meant that even his generosity had consequences he couldn't predict or control. In a world now shaped by billionaires, sovereign wealth funds, and economies too large for any single mind to comprehend, Musa's story is not ancient history. It is a mirror. The lesson isn't that wealth is dangerous. The lesson is that power without awareness of consequence is always, eventually, destabilizing, no matter how pure the intention behind it. Mansa Musa gave away gold and shook the world. Imagine what we could do or undo if we finally understood why.